All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jorge Acosta Palmer, and I'm the director of the statewide training initiative with Florida Legal Services. We're excited to have you join us here today for Specialized Therapeutic Foster Care, a pathway to stability, well-being, and permanency. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. This training is being recorded, so if you register, you're going to receive an email with the link to the recording. You're also going to receive an email to the link to the materials. For whatever reason you didn't register or you know of somebody that couldn't register, we're also going to be posting it on YouTube. In the description, I will include the CLE code, I will include the materials, and I will include speaker info as well. So the training was approved by the Florida Bar for CLE for 1.5 General CLE and 1.5 Juvenile Law Certification Credits. So I'll announce the CLE code towards the end. For whatever reason I forget, I will also put my email in there, so don't worry. I will try to drop the CLE code into the chat towards the end. I will also include it in the email that will go out within 24 hours, and I will also include it in the YouTube description. Now, this training is being co-hosted by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, or PILS, and this is where I usually do the plug for pills, but Janine, I'm gonna pass it over to you. Janine Rice is our pills share. Go for it, Janine.
Thank you so much, Jorge, and thank you for always hosting these amazing CLE opportunities. I know that PILS is very grateful, and I think the legal community at large is very grateful for your efforts. I am the chair this year of the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, and I encourage any and everybody to not just join, but to meaningfully participate. We have amazing work groups, we have committees, and we do a lot of great things. We have amicus briefs, we have advocacy, and then we have subject matter work groups. So please join if you're not currently a member, but also when you do join, please not just sign up for these work groups and committees, but engage. And if you ever have any questions, if you aren't clear about something that's related to the public interest law section, please reach out to me directly. I'm very open and accessible. So with that, I'd like to move on to introducing our speaker today. Before I tell you a little bit about his background, I want to tell you how I met him and how he came to be here today. So 5 weeks ago, almost to the day, I was at the DCF Dependency Summit up in Orlando, and I think it might have been Thursday afternoon. I was in a seminar and I saw several of my colleagues who also are attorneys ad litem in that seminar. And I was just floored in a positive way. Maybe uplifted is the better word. I was uplifted. I think everybody in the room was uplifted by this presentation. It was child-centered, but it was objective and direct, and I appreciated the honesty and also the information. And everyone I spoke to afterwards had the same opinions and impressions that I did. So I chased Taylor down in the hallway outside. Literally, I remember we were at the bottom of the stairwell, and I was asking him if he would come and present for us. And here we are 5 weeks later. And I'm just so happy to be able to introduce you to Taylor Cheeseman. He is the Executive Vice President of Operations at the Children's Home Network, which is Tampa's longest standing nonprofit supporting at-risk children and families across 8 Florida counties. He oversees a broad range of programs, including foster care, kinship care, and residential services. He is a licensed attorney and an experienced child welfare leader. Taylor previously served as commissioner of the Mississippi Department of Child Protection Services, where he directed statewide operations and led major reform initiatives. His unique background bridges legal, clinical, and operational perspectives to strengthen outcomes for children and families in care. And I think that you will find this presentation on specialized therapeutic foster care and how it can help you help your clients who are children, as well as the families that support them. And I look forward to hearing his presentation again. Take care.
Janine, and thank you to everybody else for making some time on a Friday for this conversation. I'm excited to have the chance to share this presentation with you and have a little conversation about specialized therapeutic foster care. So, as Janine mentioned, my background is a little diverse. I am an attorney by training. I did a stint as a clerk with the state Supreme Court in Mississippi and then moved into the child welfare space on the state agency side of things. And so the perspective that I bring to the presentation and to the subject matter is one from that regulatory perspective, but now informed by working in an agency that's doing the direct service work on the ground with a heavy focus in the clinical aspects of the child welfare system. So just to start, to give everybody a little bit of background about the Children's Home Network, if you're not familiar, this will give some context to the reason that we're focused on specialized foster care today. We are West Central Florida's oldest charitable organization that works in the child serving space. Like most organizations with our history, we started as an orphanage in the late 19th century, founded by a group of families in Tampa who saw unmet needs for the children in the community. We worked in the residential space and continue to work into the residential space still today. But starting in the 1960s, we really started to change the focus of our work in a more clinical direction and in a direction of broadening out the services to focus on child and family well-being more holistically. The first part of that was bringing clinical services to our residential program in Tampa. In the 90s, we moved into foster care licensing. We started kinship care work, which is a nationally rated evidence-based model focusing on supporting kinship families, and then have diversified into a broad range of children's behavioral health, early childhood education, and other foster care related programs. But today we're going to be talking about the therapeutic foster care program. And the reason for this, and a reason that I hope this can be a source of some uplifting spirits and maybe the opportunity to identify an intervention that's underutilized in this state, is that we are based in Hillsborough County, and as anyone who's familiar with Florida's child welfare system knows, you go back 5 years ago and Hillsborough County really experienced a placement crisis. It was really an unchecked crisis and a situation where many children were without the placement options that they needed. Today, that situation is much, much better. And there are a number of reasons for that. There's not a monocausal explanation for the improvement. But one of the things that we believe strongly has contributed to that is that we placed an emphasis on the development of our specialized therapeutic foster care capacity, because we believe that it's a resource that fills a gap in the placement array and the service array for children in foster care that often leads to some of the most acute placement challenges and child crises that we see. So the goals for this presentation are a little multifaceted. So I'm going to come at this from some different angles. We will talk about the regulatory requirements for an SDFC program. That's my state background leading me there. I do want to start with the law and lay out where this intervention fits in our state system of care. I want to talk about what are the components of an effective STFC model. And within that, we'll have some conversation about what an STFC model really is and what it is not, and how there are some misconceptions about this program and about this service for many working in our system of care. And then finally, we'll talk about how that relates to the children that we serve. How do we identify children that would benefit from STFC? What is the right child profile, and what are the kind of success stories and life transformation that can come from identifying the right child for this intervention? Regulatory requirements for STFC, not a shock to any of you, but it, is multi-layered with requirements in statute, administrative code, and in the Medicaid policy manuals. Now, this first statute, I think, is somewhat important. It doesn't provide a lot of content or detail about the STFC program, but it reinforces an important point that I want to make sure everybody takes away from this presentation. And that is this: the Statute 394-495 is the statute that describes the children's mental health system that the state of Florida intends to implement and support. And in a long list of mental health interventions that are identified as important or core components of that system, therapeutic foster care is one of the identified interventions. The reason I start with this statute, even though it doesn't get into the detail of what an STFC program entails or what it consists of, is the fact that this is a statute in the Florida Code addressing mental health services. And I think this is really an important point for those who may work more in the child welfare space or predominantly in the child welfare space. Is oftentimes I think we fall into the trap of thinking about specialized therapeutic foster care as another placement option. But therapeutic foster care is not primarily a placement alternative. It is a treatment program. It is funded by Medicaid. It is a children's behavioral health service. It is designed to provide a treatment intervention for children who have diagnoses that indicate they will be responsive to that treatment intervention. So I think that provides some nuance in how we think about therapeutic foster care. What I've seen sometimes is child welfare systems can err in two directions. On one hand, there can be this thinking that therapeutic foster care is just the placement option for children who present with challenging behaviors. The reality is that many children who present with challenging behaviors will meet criteria for therapeutic foster care, but many will also not. And it depends on the root cause, the precipitating condition for those behaviors that is the determinant of whether they are suitable for the treatment intervention that STFC is intended to serve as. It also informs how we think about it in our continuum of placement options. It is not primarily, though it can have this effect, a resource that exists to provide placement stability. It is a resource that exists to provide the treatment intervention, and by doing so may achieve, should achieve, hopefully will achieve placement stability by virtue of the clinical progress that's being made in the administration of that treatment intervention. So that's kind of the first big takeaway, is that this is a treatment service, and we need to think about this resource in that way in our daily work. The next piece of regulation related to therapeutic foster care is an administrative code, and this is around licensing standards. So, what this says is not a lot, right? It is the requirement that a specialized therapeutic foster home has to meet all of the licensing requirements for a traditional foster home, and there's an additional home study required. Now, as a part of Medicaid regulations and the treatment component of this program, there are also additional training requirements for an STFC home that are a part of the process of transitioning from traditional foster care to therapeutic foster care as a home, or as entering anew as a therapeutic foster care home. But the foundational requirements are the same, that a home that is serving in the therapeutic capacity still must meet all of the requirements of our traditional foster homes. And then where most of the important information about the regulatory requirements for the program are found is in the Specialized Therapeutic Services Coverage and Limitations Handbook. So this is the handbook published by ACA that provides the Medicaid regulations and requirements that govern the therapeutic foster care program. One thing that's important in the use of this manual, and I like to note this because I've seen it confuse many different people, is that the ACA publishes a series of service specific handbooks or manuals that set out these requirements for a variety of Medicaid-funded programs. One thing that's a little nuanced about this handbook is that it's a single handbook that covers multiple services. So therapeutic foster care is included in the Specialized Therapeutic Services Handbook, but is not the only service in that handbook. And so you have to be careful when if you have reason to go back and check a Medicaid requirement to verify an element of service, there catch-all requirements that apply across the board laid out in the early sections of the handbook that can apply to therapeutic foster care. And then there is a section of the handbook itself that relates only to therapeutic foster care. And in using this handbook, you need to make sure that you are referencing both sections of the handbook that may apply to your given situation. Now, some of the specifically also, just so you're aware, the other services that are covered by this handbook are comprehensive behavioral health assessments and therapeutic group care. So if you've ever had reason to look at the Medicaid requirements for those programs, you've seen this handbook before. Now, we're going to specifically talk a little bit about three important aspects of the Medicaid regulations that set out the framework within which we have to do this work. And those are the requirements related to qualification and enrollment, coverages and excluded services, and how the reimbursement system works for this service. Now, who provides therapeutic foster care services? This is another one of my favorite points to reinforce because there's something I think a little counterintuitive or maybe outside of what we normally experience in a child welfare context in the expectations for the delivery of these therapeutic services. So every therapeutic foster care program is going to involve some of the mental health professionals that you would expect. You have a psychiatrist who's the treating psychiatrist. If there's any medication management happening, they are the one responsible for that as the MD. You have a treating practitioner who is going to be a physician, a psychiatrist. It can be an ARMP, a BPA. It could be an LCSW, an LMHC, some licensed mental health professional who is the treating practitioner responsible for the development and oversight of the treatment plan. You may also have primary clinicians. So this could either be that licensed mental health professional who developed the treatment plan and who's responsible for its administration, or it could be a master's level therapist who is working under the oversight and supervision of that licensed mental health clinician. None of that is out of the ordinary, right? These are the typical roles of treating clinicians in a therapeutic services model. What's different about this model, and I think important to understand, is that the Medicaid handbook clearly talks about the specialized therapeutic foster parent as a part of the treatment team. They are a treating professional within the context of this program, in addition to the master's level therapist, the licensed clinician, and the psychiatrist. And that's the reason for that is that the service itself is not just the medication management that a psychiatrist provides. It is not just the individual therapy sessions that the licensed counselor or the master's level therapist provides. It's also the care that the therapeutic foster parent provides on a day in and day out basis. They are expected to have the knowledge and skills from the additional training that they are required to obtain in order to become a therapeutic foster parent to be able to meet the day in and day out needs of the child therapeutically. And so it's an interesting role. I mean, all of our foster parents, our traditional foster parents, our licensed level 1 caregivers, they're all entrusted with the primary responsibility of the day-to-day care of a child. But the expectation for therapeutic foster parents is something higher. It is that they are committing to take on a skill set of therapeutic intervention, not to the level of a professional therapist, but at a level that exceeds that of a traditional foster parent or foster parent. Now, outside of the scope of the SDFC program in terms of what is funded by Medicaid as SCFC services, but often related to the SDFC program are licensing specialists and targeted case managers. Obviously, these are licensed foster homes. Each one has an assigned licensing specialist, and they need to be able to work in conjunction with the treatment team in an effective therapeutic services model. STFC is also often, though not always, coupled with a targeted case management program. So targeted case management is not our traditional dependency case management that's focused on permanency planning or what's taking place in the dependency court proceedings. The targeted case managers are an overlay and a wraparound support to assist in meeting the needs of the child, particularly those related to their mental health. So this can be navigation of other services outside of what's provided by the treating clinicians in this program itself. So special qualifications. I think this is an important point for those who are going into the practice of clinical work, but for the rest of us who are operating as attorneys and need to know the basics, it may be a little less important. But just so you know, the licensed clinicians and the master's level therapists who work in an STFC program are required to have experience. There's a recognition in the Medicaid guidelines that therapeutic foster care typically is supporting children in a crisis state, and that this is not necessarily the therapeutic practice that is best for entry-level clinicians. It's something that a more experienced clinician is really better equipped and should be employed to address. There's also specialized training requirements that are an important component that focus in on the types of presenting issues that we see in a therapeutic services model. Now, for the therapeutic foster parent, this is where things I think are really interesting. The expectation, as I said, is that they are a part of the treatment team. And part of that preparation is that there are 30 additional hours of training required to become a therapeutic foster parent, which are in addition to the training that they did to meet the standards for traditional foster parent licensing. So it's a significant step up in the requirements for their preparation to provide the service. They also have ongoing training requirements of either 8 or 12 hours, depending on that are on a 6-month basis, that depend on the level of care that they provide. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. This is also a requirement that I think is really a challenge and something that needs to be understood by those who choose to become therapeutic foster parents, is that there is an actual explicit expectation in the Medicaid handbook that therapeutic foster parents are available 24 hours a day to provide therapeutic interventions. And I like this quote where it talks about that the foster parent is the primary agent in the delivery of therapeutic services to the recipient. So the psychiatrist, the licensed counselor, the master's level therapist, they are a part of the treatment team. But the core intervention of a therapeutic foster care model is what the foster parent does with the child in the home environment on a regular basis. Some other key elements, of course, the homes have to meet licensure standards. There is a requirement in the Medicaid handbook that there is a financial agreement between the therapeutic foster care agency and the foster parent to reimburse the parents for the therapeutic intervention services. This typically takes the form of a daily per diem that is paid in addition to the regular room and board rate that a foster parent receives as with their traditional level 2 licensing. Another important thing that I think this really reinforces is that this framing about reimbursement for the therapeutic interventions they provide, it really is reinforcing this idea that the therapeutic foster parent is viewed almost as a mental health professional in this context, which I think is a more demanding but also formal role than we recognize for traditional foster parents. And then there's these principles that the manual sets out for policies in a therapeutic services model that tell us a little bit about what the model is intended to achieve. And so it has to promote good therapeutic practice. It has to ensure that the foster parents are that primary agent. So the foster parents are not just a holding place for these children and the therapist doing the work. They are the primary agent of the treatment plans. There have to be treatment plans and documentation of the services provided and procedures in place to protect the rights of recipients and their families. Now, we talk about this multidisciplinary team and we talk about having different levels of mental health clinician in this more formal role for the foster parents. So what are the roles within a therapeutic services model? How are the day-to-day responsibilities distributed amongst those with responsibility, and who is it that we serve in a therapeutic foster care program? So first and foremost, as I said at the outset, therapeutic foster care is a behavioral health service. It is primarily a treatment intervention, not a placement option. So, the threshold requirement for a child's eligibility to move into a therapeutic foster care program is medical necessity, as it is with every other treatment intervention. So it's a clinical service. It must be deemed clinically necessary. And what you have here is a list of the types of criteria that would make this service meet medically necessary criteria. So what are those things? It's necessary to protect life, prevent significant illness or disability, or alleviate pain. It's individualized, specific, and consistent with symptoms or confirmed diagnosis, and not more than the patient needs. So it should not be an excessively intense intervention given the symptoms and the diagnosis that the child is presenting with. It needs to be consistent with accepted professional medical standards. It needs to be safely furnished, and there needs to be no equally effective or more conservative or less costly treatment option available. This is the same construct that in a placement context we think about every day in child welfare of least restrictive placement, right? It's the least restrictive treatment intervention. If the child's needs can be met with an outpatient therapy model without placement in a therapeutic services home, then they don't need to be placed in a therapeutic services home, and it's not medically necessary. And then finally, this one I think is really key, and I think it's a challenge for child welfare systems to wrestle with, is it is furnished in a manner not primarily intended for the convenience of the recipient's caretaker, or the provider. Now, why do I say that's a key issue for child welfare systems? Is it gets back to this point about placement option versus treatment intervention. The reason for STFC eligibility cannot be that there is a lack of other placement options. That standing alone is not grounds for medical necessity. There has to be something about the child's symptoms or diagnosis that make the treatment intervention of therapeutic foster care medically necessary, and it cannot be that therapeutic foster care is used for the convenience of the child welfare system in finding a placement option. Now, there is a caveat to that I want to put out there, and this is a practice that varies across the state of Florida. It's not a uniform system put in place at the state level or amongst our lead child welfare agencies. There are lead child welfare agencies in this state who, in the absence of Medicaid eligibility, will pay out of their own funds for a child to be placed in a therapeutic foster care program. In those circumstances, we're not constrained by these requirements because the Medicaid handbook is inapplicable because Medicaid's not being billed for that service. Now, that can be a good and appropriate practice. I still would argue that it is not appropriate for a therapeutic bed to be occupied simply to find a placement option, because then you're potentially denying that placement capacity to children who medically do need the treatment interventions of that service. However, there are children who may not meet medical necessity, but for whom the child's multidisciplinary team believes a greater degree of stability and well-being can be achieved with placement in a therapeutic foster home, either because the therapeutic foster parent is more skilled, or because even though it doesn't formally tie to a diagnosis or a specific set of symptoms, there's some benefit from the therapy that therapeutic services provider can provide that the child will benefit from. And in those circumstances, it can be appropriate for that private pay arrangement to be used to allow access to the service for a child who doesn't meet medical necessity or some other requirement from the Medicaid regulations. Now, what is the purpose of STFC, right? We talk about medical necessity, we talk about benefiting from treatment, but benefiting from treatment to what end? So STFC is intended to reduce the recipient's disability and restore that individual to the best possible functional level. I think that this quote here is a really good encapsulation. The goal of specialized therapeutic foster care is to enable a recipient to manage and to work toward the resolution of emotional, behavioral, or psychiatric problems in a highly supportive, individualized, and flexible home setting. So what does that mean? One thing is that, certainly there are children, and we'll talk about some case studies later in the presentation that show the success stories like this. There are some children who may remain in a therapeutic home for a very long time. There are some children who may exit from a therapeutic home directly to permanency or to, in some circumstances, aging out of foster care. But in more cases than not, the goal of the therapeutic foster care program is going to be able to achieve a sufficient level, a sufficient amount of improvement in the child's emotional and mental well-being that they are able to step down to a least restrictive placement, whether that is a traditional foster home, or that is moving into a prospective adoption home, or that is moving into their home of origin with a plan of reunification. So it really should be focused on improving well-being, improving stability, reducing those symptoms that drove the medical necessity for the intervention in the first place, so that the child is able to progress towards a permanency outcome. The individualized treatment plan is also key. So a therapeutic foster care model will have some kind of treatment intervention that they use. So for instance, most models, we train our therapists in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy as our core treatment intervention. It's a model that applies well to most children in foster care because of its trauma focus. But not every child presents with needs that are responsive to the same clinical interventions. And one of the keys of the therapeutic foster care model is that the treatment interventions, the treatment plan, is supposed to be individualized to that child's needs. So, for instance, we've had circumstances where TFCBT is our primary clinical intervention, but we had a younger child who ended up in our therapeutic foster care program, and parent-child interaction therapy was a more appropriate intervention in that case for that child. And we had one of our therapists who was trained in that model and was able to employ it. So it should be a nuanced model. You should not be seeing rote treatment plans that are identical for every child in the program. They should be tailored to the specific presenting needs and symptomology of that child. These treatment plans are based on assessment of the child's mental health status. That seems like it goes without saying, but we need fresh assessments for STFC. So either the child needs to have received a comprehensive assessment of some type within the past 6 months, or the child needs a CBHA specifically within the past year, and our treatment planning and their eligibility needs to be based on the results of those formalized assessments. The treatment plans also need to work towards the achievement of measurable discharge criteria. This goes back to the point that the program is supposed to be moving this child towards a state of stability and well-being that facilitates permanency or placement in a less restrictive setting. And so the treatment plan itself should set out what those criteria are for discharge, what the goals are we're trying to achieve clinically that we believe will prepare that child for that transition. And then the treatment team needs to participate in aftercare planning. There has to be a warm handoff when that child successfully discharges the program into a less restrictive placement or into a potential setting of permanency. There needs to be a plan for how that child is going to continue to be supported after they leave the therapeutic services program. Authorization. So we need medical necessity. We need the assessments that support that determination of medical necessity. But specialized therapeutic foster care also has to be authorized through the multidisciplinary team. So this is an important point of procedure. The authorization of the multidisciplinary team is what unlocks eligibility for the therapeutic services provider to bill Medicaid for this service. And a reauthorization of that determination by the MDT is necessary no less than every 6 months. So, in every case where there is a therapeutic foster care placement, that determination has to be revisited no less than 6 months, but in truth should be discussed at least more frequently, not for a redetermination of eligibility, but to check in on the clinical progress and the movement towards meeting those goals for discharge criteria. There are also 2 levels of therapeutic foster care that are important to understand, and one of those has 2 components. So, the criteria for these services vary, as do the minimum service requirements. So, the level of service to the child and the criteria the child brings to be eligible for the service both drive the determination of the level that they are going to be admitted to. And there is an opportunity to admit a child to an STFC home and to begin their receipt of clinical services before that determination eligibility if they are determined to need crisis intervention services. But this is limited to 30 days, and the assessment that drives their ultimate eligibility for the therapeutic services going forward must be initiated within the first 10 days of that 30-day period. So the way to think about that practically is, if there is a child who is becoming significantly destabilized in terms of their behavioral and emotional and psychiatric state, and that crisis is going to lead to, say, a placement disruption, that crisis is expected to lead to the need for a more intensive treatment intervention than the child is currently receiving, that can be the basis for that admission on a crisis basis into the therapeutic foster care program, so that the multidisciplinary team can then convene once assessment results are obtained to make a long-term determination about eligibility. But if they are admitted on that crisis basis and the assessment results do not lead to long-term qualification for the program, they will ultimately then have to step down at the end of that 30-day period into a traditional setting, or Medicaid is not going to be able to pay for the placement, and that responsibility will have to shift to the placing lead child welfare agency. So what are these 2 levels and who needs the service? So level 1 STFC services are the less intense services. It's based on a history of abuse, neglect, or delinquent behavior. So that is a condition for all children who receive therapeutic foster care. They have to have some form of emotional disturbance or serious emotional disturbance. That is the diagnostic criteria that the assessments are looking at. And they need admission to a psychiatric hospital, a crisis stabilization unit, or a residential treatment center without STFC placement, or they have been admitted to one of those settings in the last 2 years. This is the criteria that I've seen create a stumbling block for some multidisciplinary teams, some placing agencies. It is not necessarily true, it is not always true, that the child has to have had one of these inpatient treatment stints in the last 2 years. That can be grounds for criteria, but it's not a required grounds. This is a disjunctive requirement. If the child is expected to need placement in one of these more intense treatment settings, that alone is enough for their eligibility in STFC. So the way to think about that is STFC is a less intensive, it is a less restrictive environment than psychiatric inpatient, crisis stabilization, residential treatment. And so when a child is being looked at for potential admission to those true inpatient treatment settings, they should be evaluated to determine whether they can be sufficiently served, whether their needs can be met in the less restrictive therapeutic foster care model before they are admitted to those inpatient treatment settings. That's level 1 criteria. Level 2 is our more intense level of care. And what is that based on? It is based on the presence of severe maladaptive behavior. So a child, to qualify for level 2, they need to meet all of the level 1 criteria, and they need to present with either significant property destruction, physical aggression, self-inflicted injuries, suicidal ideation or gestures, or struggles with daily living activities. The primary difference between level 1 and level 2 is the frequency of the therapist's contact with the child. That's the minimum frequency, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about what that context and what that frequency looks like. But essentially, the division here between level 1 and level 2 is that the children qualified for level 2 are who need more frequent therapeutic intervention. And it's high risk behaviors that are going to drive that determination. So we'll talk about these service roles, and really you've got these 3 components that we're going to talk about with the therapeutic service model and what it's intended to achieve. So the treatment intervention, we've talked about some, the placement option, and we've talked about how that's not the primary role, and then permanency support as well. So you have that primary clinician, they supervise the work of the foster parents, they evaluate and assess the recipients, they provide the training to the foster parents, coordinate with placing agencies. They are also responsible, and I think this is a key note, for preparing and training biological or legal parents to resume care. So if we're trying to move a child from therapeutic foster care into an adoptive placement or into their home of origin for reunification, then a part of the role of the therapeutic services provider is to help prepare that child's parents to continue some of the support that they've received in the therapeutic foster care model. Coordinating with targeted case management, conducting home visits, monitoring progress towards the completion of that treatment plan, and then observing the child in community settings to see that they're benefiting from the service. The level of service and the caseload that these primary clinicians carry varies depending on the level of child. So the Medicaid regulations are accounting for the fact that those level 2 kids who need more frequent contact should be a greater focus for their primary clinician. So those children who are those clinicians who only serve children in the level 1 criteria and who work on a full-time basis in their role as a therapist can carry a caseload of up to 8 kids. Those who work part-time can carry a caseload of up to 4 kids. But if any one of the children on that therapist caseload, on that clinician's caseload, are level 2 or crisis level, those caseload caps drop to 6 and 3 respectively. So the regulations and the caseloads account for that more intense intervention. And the primary differentiation, as I mentioned, is that is a matter of minimum service levels. Now, this is not what you would see in every case. It's not the totality of the contact or the services provided. But in terms of the minimum service levels, with a level 1 child, that primary clinician is going to see the child no less than once per week. So they're going to have a session with that child every week. With a child who is level 2 or crisis level, that's going to double to a minimum of 2 sessions per week. So that's the primary difference in terms of the level of service with that distinction. Treatment plans, those requirements also vary based on the levels. So for a level 1 child, you should have a treatment plan developed within 30 days, and that needs to be reviewed quarterly. But with a level 2 or crisis level child, that plan needs to be in place within 14 days and reviewed monthly. Reason for that, the more truncated requirements on the level 2 and crisis level is, one, those needs are more acute. The child's presenting in a crisis state, and so the treatment plan and treatment interventions need to be in place as fast as possible. And number 2, the monthly review cycle is because the child should be being reassessed to see if they can step down from that level 2 to a level 1, or if they can move from therapeutic foster care into a less restrictive placement. And so with the more intense intervention, a more regular periodicity of reviewing that plan is required. Psychiatry is also an important component here. Even though in most circumstances virtually all circumstances, the psychiatrist is not going to be that primary clinician. That's going to be your licensed mental health counselor, your licensed clinical social worker, and your master's level therapist doing that work. The psychiatrist is responsible for interviewing the recipient, reviewing the treatment plan that primary clinician has prepared, for significant changes, and provide that review on the schedule above. And so your psychiatrist is a check on the other clinicians in the development and administration of the plan. Another thing that's important is that weekly progress summaries are required for STFC. And so we really are, you can see in these Medicaid guidelines, we're really focusing on measuring progress, because this is not intended to be a placement where the child is placed and then left. As I mentioned before, we do use TFCBT as our primary treatment intervention. This is a model that's pretty common within the child welfare space, and it has evidence-based ratings. It focuses on psychoeducation, relaxation, affective modulation, cognitive coping. Trauma narration is a big part of it. So this is the primary treatment intervention that's going to be used in a therapeutic foster care model when the child's clinical needs are primarily the product of a trauma history. And for a child who's being served in foster care, that is going to be most of the children served. Now, let's talk about placement stability. So STFC, obviously, at its core, is primarily measuring its impact in clinical progress. It is not, as we've talked about, primarily intended as a placement option. That said, placement stability is a real benefit of an effective STFC program, and it is something that you should see with an STFC program that is being well operated and is having its intended result clinically. So why is that the case? So a part of it is crisis response. So we read the requirement that therapeutic foster parent is supposed to be available 24/7 to meet the child's therapeutic needs. At CHN, our therapists are also on call. Our clinical team is on call 24/7 to respond to crises for that involving the child on their caseload. And one thing that we've done as a therapeutic services provider is to try to geolocate our case assignments so that those response times, the therapists who are assigned a child are the therapists who are in closest geographic proximity to those children, so that there are quick response times. Why do I talk about this here? Because this is, I think, one of the real advantages of STFC in facilitating greater placement stability. Because when the child starts to destabilize, when they start to decompensate, when they start to engage in those high-risk behaviors that often lead to placement disruptions, the difference in an STFC model as opposed to a traditional model is you have a foster parent who has been specifically trained to intervene in those circumstances, and you have a therapist or other clinical staff who are on call to provide support to that foster parent, and that provides a great opportunity to stabilize those behaviors and head off that placement disruption in the moment of crisis. Another thing that we do as a model, as a provider, this is not something that Medicaid requires. It's that you won't see this in the handbook itself, but we see it as a part of our role as a therapeutic services provider, is that our therapists are on hand to assist the foster parents with other types of challenging issues that don't rise to that true crisis state. So we've seen circumstances where we have a child in a therapeutic foster care in our therapeutic foster care program with a medication protocol, and the child is refusing to take their medications. It's a way that they're trying to exercise some control and pushing back on the foster parent. We've sent therapists out to process through that with the child and the foster parent, and to help get that child to a point of willingness to take their prescribed medication. We've done the same things with school refusals, right? Children who, real challenge for a foster parent if a child refuses to go to school. Therapist is a resource to come and help process with that child why it is in their best interest to attend school. Behavior management. Our therapeutic foster parents are expected to be able to manage most behaviors. But it also, in a well-operated therapeutic services program, it shouldn't fall to them solely to do so. And our therapists are available to support them in that work. And then foster parent support, therapist partnering, and leadership accessibility. This is something that I think is really key, and it's a differentiator of a quality STFC program. Is foster parents should have a regular and open line of communication, not just with their therapist, but with the leadership of their therapeutic foster care program. They are a part of the therapeutic services team. They are a treating practitioner for purposes of this program. And so they should be brought into the conversations with their clinical leadership in the same way that a therapist is. Doesn't mean all of the conversations will be the same. Doesn't mean every conversation involving the child is going to involve every part of the child's clinical team, because each practitioner has their own distinct roles. But a foster parent who's serving in this capacity is somebody who should be a part of regular clinical staffing, because they are the primary agent of the treatment intervention. Permanency. I think this is the most overlooked aspect of the value of a therapeutic foster care program and the virtue of a therapeutic foster care program. So, what we've seen over time is that many child welfare systems will look to therapeutic foster care as a source of placement stability. I understand why that happens. There's more scrutiny on placement stability than maybe any other measure or any other aspect of our child welfare system. Placement stability is a key driver of well-being for a child, of likelihood of achieving permanency for a child. So placement stability is vitally important. Um, but therapeutic foster care has some other advantages. It should be supporting a child's progress in ways that go beyond mere placement stability. And so, one thing that we've really tried to emphasize, and that I hope people come to understand about therapeutic foster care, is that therapeutic foster care is an intervention that should be focused on helping achieve permanency for children in foster care. Yeah, I get on a little bit of a tangent and soapbox here, right? But at the end of the day, everything that we do in our child welfare system, in our work related to the child welfare system, ultimately should be geared towards achieving permanency. That is the ultimate end of the system of care. And therapeutic foster care is not an exception to that principle. So, what does that look like? Reunification and adoption preparation. I touched on this earlier, but I think that there's a real value when you are preparing to transition a child from a therapeutic foster care program to an adoptive home, to their biological parents' home, to even a traditional foster home, in the transition planning that should come from that. The therapist is an individual with a deep understanding of that child's mental health and well-being, what their state of mind is at a given moment in time, what interventions they are responsive to, what interventions they are not responsive to. And so the child's primary clinician is well equipped to coach the parent, whether that's a prospective adoptive parent, that's a biological parent, that's a traditional foster parent, about how they may need to approach this child differently than they would another child that's been placed in their home, or than they did in the past when this child was in their home previously. There also is the therapeutic services clinical team is the ones who train the therapeutic foster parents in their skills and abilities to support these children. And so, though we're not going to provide the full 30 hours of training necessarily, although that's not necessary, they are prepared to train foster parents or biological parents or prospective adoptive parents in some of the skills that they will need to know in assuming care for this child. But the other piece that I think is really profound and overlooked in a lot of circumstances is, because we've invested so much in therapeutic foster parents as an expert in the clinical care and support of the child that they've had placed in their home, they become an incredibly valuable resource for co-parenting and preparing biological parents or prospective adoptive parents for the care that they will provide. And we're going to talk about that in one of our success stories in a minute. Another value add with STFC towards permanency planning is clinical consultation when it comes to adoption home matching or vetting potential adoptive placements. The clinical team, including the foster parent, so that foster parent, that primary clinician, they will know that child's needs, what they respond to better than anyone. They are a vital resource and should be consulted every time a child in a therapeutic foster home is looking to move or is preparing to move into a prospective adoptive placement. And they should be engaged in the question of adoption mapping because they can provide clinical and therapeutic insights in finding that right match that's going to lead to a lasting adoption. And then finally, case activities, judicial hearings, MDTs, placement staffings. Once again, that knowledge that the clinical team possesses is something that should be heard in all of these settings. And I will say, just knowing that your practice is going to be largely centered in those judicial hearings, not exclusively, but largely focused on those hearings. I will say that is the context in which we've seen inconsistency over time in the value of that therapeutic perspective. We as a therapeutic foster care agency oftentimes have had to fight to make sure that we get notice of hearings, that our treating clinicians are given an opportunity to testify in those hearings to present that perspective. And personally, I'm pretty strongly of the belief that if the court and the attorneys who are representing all of the interest in that dependency case are not clearly hearing and having the opportunity to vet the clinical perspective of that child's care, then they're not making informed decisions. And it does not matter what that decision is, whether it's related to permanency planning, it's related to placement moves, it's related to even aspects of a permanent plan that are focused on the parent or not the child. The therapeutic needs of that child should be informing all of that. The clinical progress of the child should be informing all of that. And so if we're going to have a real child-centered approach, the clinical team's perspective should be in the forefront of every one of these conversations and every one of these forums as these cases progress. So I'm going to transition here and share a few success stories that I hope will illustrate some of what I've talked about, and then we'll have some time for Q&A once we walk through these. So the first story is we're going to have some foster parent stories, and then we're going to have some child stories because I want to show both sides of the equation in therapeutic foster care. So this first one, we have a foster parent who was a regular foster parent for 7 years, and their pattern of accepting placements over time was that they would traditionally serve teen boys who presented with some high risk behaviors, but as the challenge of those behaviors started to wear on them year after year, this foster parent fell into a pretty bad habit. They would give what I would call conditional acceptance of placements. I'll take the child, but I'm not committing to take them long term. And the reason for that was that they were concerned that if they accepted a child who had high risk behaviors as a traditional foster parent, the child would be placed and everybody else involved in that child's case would wash their hands of it and walk away, and they would be left to struggle on their own. And they felt that if they reached a point where they could no longer provide safe care to the child, that those concerns would not be seriously heard and respected. And so their workaround was to say, well, I'm going to accept the child, but I'm not really going to commit. And that was just a terrible state for the child to not have the certainty of a long-term placement. It was a terrible state for the system of care to not know that the child had a long-term placement. And so this was actually one of our homes that we had licensed as a traditional foster home. And so our team sat down with them and said, listen, like, number one, we're not going to accept this. This doesn't align with our values as a foster care program. We want to see long-term placement. But number two, we understand your concerns. We understand what has motivated you towards this behavior. And so we had a conversation about their strengths and about how shifting to STFC would align the resources that they have in support of their work with the types of youth they have traditionally accepted. So they ultimately, after a series of conversations, a dialogue back and forth, us being able to give the assurances of what the additional training would provide them, the support the therapist and the broader clinical team would provide, they made that decision to make the jump from traditional foster care to therapeutic foster care. And since they've done that, they've been one of our strongest foster parents. They consistently have 4 boys aged 10 to 13 in their home. All of the boys that we've placed with them have had lengthy histories of placement disruption and instability. We've had some of the boys in this home have been disrupted from residential programs that are on the more intense or resource equipped end of the spectrum of residential programs. And what we've seen is placed in this home with the support of the clinical team and a therapeutic foster care model, and with the additional skills the therapeutic training provided that foster parent, he has been able to consistently stabilize those placements. The next circumstance or case scenario I want to share is I think one of the most extraordinary stories I've seen in my entire career in child welfare. And it's a circumstance that when I worked at the state level in Mississippi, we saw a couple of times and was almost universally without a positive resolution. But here we did see a real positive resolution that I think was shocking to everybody involved. So we had a child older teenager who was engaged in increasingly severe self-harming behaviors. They were not necessarily suicide attempts, though there was some suicidal ideation involved, but more non-suicidal acts of self-harm. So this was consuming foreign objects, including batteries. This was cutting herself in various ways, and oftentimes inserting foreign objects into open wounds. The consequence of this was that this child was experiencing 6 to 10 Baker Acts per month. And I always pause here and say that is not a typo. That is not 6 to 10 Baker Acts per year. That is, this child would come in and out of Baker Acts on an almost daily basis. And her habit of inserting foreign objects into open wounds and of ingesting foreign objects actually resulted in 5 major surgeries to remove those objects and repair damage. So this was a child who was in an extreme state of mental health crisis on a long-term basis, and whose mental health crisis was resulting in real physical harm and threat of ultimately of death in an extreme scenario. This child was screened nationwide for psychiatric inpatient treatment services. So not only was every resource in the state of Florida exhausted, true nationwide screening was invoked. She was accepted on 3 different occasions to true inpatient treatment programs. These are not group homes. These are not residential programs with mental health overlays. These are true inpatient treatment programs. And she was discharged unsuccessfully all 3 times. It got so bad that this child was then admitted for electroconvulsive therapy. In full transparency, at the time that this case was transpiring, I did not know that electroconvulsive therapy was still being used in this context or with minors. And after she underwent this extreme intervention, she returned to a congregate care setting where she was discharged immediately with self-harming behaviors that started as soon as she left that intensive treatment. So this child, I can't overstate, was really at a place where there was no option. There was not an inpatient treatment program or residential group home program in the country that would accept this child because they all viewed the risk of harm and ultimately of some liability on their part as intolerable. And they all believed that there was no prospect for success with her treatment. So we were in an interesting place in this case because not only are we a therapeutic services provider, but we operate the placement services office that was trying to place this child. And ultimately, about 6 months before her 18th birthday, we were able to convince one of our therapeutic foster parents to give this a chance. And so this therapeutic foster parent stepped forward. She agreed that she would limit her capacity to this one child. She would focus all of her energy and time on serving this one child. We agreed that the therapist and the foster parent would have an intense pace of meetings. I mean, they were talking daily about the child's care. The therapist was there many, many times a week to provide support to the foster parent. And upon that admission to the therapeutic foster care program, for the 6 months preceding that child's 18th birthday, she only had one more Baker Act admission. She needed no additional major medical interventions. She actually engaged in independent living services and she ultimately exited to extended foster care. In my career, I've never seen a turnaround this drastic with any other intervention. And the reason for it was a foster parent's willingness to step up and say, I will be the primary agent of change in this child's life when no inpatient or residential program in the country felt they could do so. That's the kind of challenge that the therapeutic foster parents commit to take, are trained to take, and where they can have a profound impact on a child's life in a way that most people will never have the opportunity to do. So here's another example. Talk about some other youth that have been seen success in our therapeutic foster care program. So we had a 6-year-old who had weeks of placement instability, who was separated from a sibling because of physical aggression. There were multiple adults required for transport, and this is a 6-year-old, to give you an idea of how extreme this is, because the child would escape from seatbelts, would jump from moving cars, would take off their clothes. Child was refusing all medication. This child had been expelled from 6 daycare and school programs by age 6 because of their behaviors. Um, and ultimately, they were admitted into our STFC program. You know, when they arrived at the STFC program, we have this note that they had a urine stained backpack because one of the child's behaviors was that they would urinate on their own personal belongings. This case was also complicated by significant medical issues that the child presented with. And so, you know, there really were not a lot of hopes for anything more than immediate stability. This was one of these cases where if we could just get the child stabilized in a placement, stabilized in a school setting, and so that they're not constantly cycling through every source of stability and consistency in their life, it would be a huge win. And so we had a foster parent who, like the last one we discussed, decided that they would step up. And so they became duly licensed as a therapeutic foster parent and as a medical foster parent so that they could serve both the mental health and medical needs of this child. With this home environment and the wraparound clinical supports, they're able to meet this child's need. The aggressive behaviors were reduced significantly, and the child was able to start for the very first time sharing their feelings. It was something that the child had really repressed and was holding in a lot of hurt and anger, and connected both with the therapist and the foster parent in a way that they became trusted adults that the child would share with. And ultimately, that progress was so profound that we were able to reunify the child with their sister. And so this is another value, I think, irrespective of placement stability, irrespective of permanency. One of the things we see is that when we have sibling groups and one of the children is in a greater state of crisis than the other, that can often be what leads to separation of sibling relationships. And so this is a good example of how the therapeutic foster care model can ultimately facilitate the reunification of those siblings through the clinical progress it makes with the child. And then finally, for our last example, we had a child who was sheltered at 4 years of age and experienced 24 placement moves in 7 months. It astounds me every time I read that statistic, that I talk about this case, is because to think that a 4-year-old could turn over a placement that frequently is just astonishing to me. But this child struggled with emotional regulation, with elopement, with peer boundary, with bullying behavior, aggression, extended temper tantrums, daycare expulsions. It was really a tumultuous environment for the caregiver in any given placement, because this child was in such a state of crisis. They were so destabilized that these behaviors were essentially constant. But because of the child's age, there was reluctance on the part of the multidisciplinary team and the lead agency to approve the child for STFC placement. But our team was very proactive in advocating for eligibility on this one, because they saw an opportunity to make some headway with the right clinical intervention. And I alluded to this story earlier in the presentation. So they were placed in an STFC home, and because of their age, we didn't come in with our traditional TFCBT approach. We brought in one of our therapists who was trained in parent-child psychotherapy, and they were able then to step in and build a relationship between the foster parent and the child, and between the child and the child's father, that ultimately facilitated supervised visitation that was a source of de-escalation for the child's behaviors. The child at such a young age was really struggling with separation from their parent. And so that parent-child psychotherapy was a real opportunity to get at the core issue that was driving the instability and the state of crisis that this child was experiencing. Then the foster parent also took a really active role in advocating for more services. This foster parent became a champion for this child and really focusing on educational intervention. And then when the foster parent's adult son left the home, she converted his room so that she could create more space to bring the sibling in and reunify this child with a sibling. And one of the things that really one of the ways in which this foster parent really stepped up is they placed a focus on engaging with the child's father, and not just helping facilitate visitation, not just being a source of connection or contact between the child and the child's father, but also taking an active role in equipping that father to prepare himself to give this child the care they needed upon reunification. And the ultimate outcome in this case was that both the child and their sibling were ultimately reunified with the father because of the foster parent's efforts to do so. So I hope you've kind of seen that therapeutic foster care is a lot of things. It's more than a placement option. It is a treatment intervention, but it's a treatment intervention that can be used strategically to advance not just stability and well-being for the child, but permanency, and really can equip not just foster caregivers, but biological parents, adoptive parents, anyone who's going to assume care, can equip them to do that in an appropriate and therapeutically informed way. So I really think that if we placed more focus on building therapeutic foster care capacity, it really shows the potential to radically transform outcomes for both children and parents in the child welfare system, because of the way that it holistically works towards both short-term stability and long-term positive outcomes. So I'm going to stop there. I think we've got about 15 minutes left, and we can move into any Q&A that we may have.
Yeah, we actually had one question already pop in. This question was asked around the 30-minute mark or so. It was early on. And the question, I'm going to read it out loud and drop it in the chat just in case.
Sure.
Here's the question. And the question is, how do you best deal with the trauma of a built-in placement move? If a kid does well in the therapeutic placement, then they have to move?
So I think that's a great question. And the answer to the second part of the question is yes, some point. So what I would say is what we typically see as therapeutic foster care placements are not short term, right? Most of the placements we see, we're not talking about 30, 60, 90-day placements. We're talking 6 months, 9 months, a year is really the norm or the average in these placements. So I don't want when I talk about the program being geared towards creating enough stability to move to a different placement, I don't want that to sound like this is creating placement turnover on a monthly or quarterly basis. That's why that 6-month reevaluation is really key, is there's not an expectation that there's going to be a move in a shorter time frame than that. And I would say more often than not, that first 6-month reevaluation does lead to continued qualification for a longer duration of service. Now, how you deal best with the trauma of a placement move, I think, is really where we get to some of that co-parenting and some of the work of the therapist. So if a child has been admitted to an SDFC program and has had a successful course of treatment and has reached a state of stability that they did not have upon admission, you absolutely do not transition that child overnight into a traditional foster home or even a prospective adoptive placement or their biological parents' home without a very thoughtful transition process. And that transition process should involve the therapeutic foster parent, the therapist, and the parent who is going to assume care for that child to be working in close coordination on the child's care on a regular basis for weeks and months before the ultimate transition. That the child should never experience that transition as a surprise. The other thing I want to point out is that when we talk about less restrictive placements, I should have mentioned this earlier. One of the things that is, I think, really valuable about STFC and its place in the placement relay is that STFC is a less restrictive placement than group care, even than non-therapeutic group care, because it is still a family-based placement. And so why I think that's valuable is that when we talk about preparing for, the trauma that can be implicit in a placement move, we're not talking about moving that child, a successful STFC placement, into a congregate setting. That if a child's been successful in their treatment in STFC, it should be into another family-based setting where those personal relationships can be built by involvement in the child's care for a substantial period of time before the transition. So I think the answer to that question really is from an advocacy perspective, is even if a child's reaching the point of meeting their discharge goals, everybody in the case should be advocating that any transition out of that therapeutic foster care program is thoughtful and planned and not rushed for the sake of getting the child out of the therapeutic placement.
Right, thank you. There's another question that just came in. I'm gonna read it out. I'm gonna drop it in the chat and read it out loud as well. The question is, how many STFCs are there in Florida? How many children can be served, and what is being done to recruit more?
So I do not know the statewide capacity, so I can speak for CHN. So we operate therapeutic foster care in Hillsborough, Pinellas, Pasco, Polk, Hardy, and Highlands County. In those counties, we have about 50 beds licensed. Now, it's a little bit less than that with preferred capacity. We run close to occupancy. Now, one thing that is important about statewide capacity is that Medicaid funded therapeutic foster care is a statewide program. So just because I have a therapeutic foster home licensed in Hillsborough County, it does not mean that that home is limited to serving Hillsborough County youth. This is a Medicaid service. Any child who's enrolled in the Child Welfare Specialty Plan with Sunshine is going to be a potential admission to any therapeutic foster home across the state. So it's something that should be screened statewide. What is being done to recruit more? I can tell you how our example has worked, and I think it's relatively unique. To be completely frank, to my knowledge, outside of the work that we've done in Hillsborough County, I don't know of significant expansion in therapeutic foster care capacity. There may be other examples that I'm not aware of. But it's the only one with which I'm familiar. Our approach to growing therapeutic foster care capacity, which ultimately resulted in about a 700% increase in capacity over a 2-year period, was using traditional foster care as a training ground and a farming ground for therapeutic foster parents. We have a large traditional foster care licensing program that gave us the advantage of partnering with some of our foster parents to assess their capacity with some challenging placements, and then to use that as a stepping off point for a conversation about recruiting more, or about making that transition into the therapeutic environment. And really what we've seen is that is the best recruitment model for therapeutic foster care. Asking somebody to come in off the street with no experience as a foster parent and jump right into therapeutic foster care is a big lift, and it's ultimately something that can set that person up for failure. There are exceptional people who can do that. We have licensed homes that way, but the best pathway, the most reliable pathway, is to recruit the exceptional parents from traditional licensing and level them up to the therapeutic level. I see the next question that relates to that about who's responsible for developing STFC placements. So the answer, DCF, CBC, ACA, it's a little bit of all of the above, but I would say ultimately the responsibility falls on the individual therapeutic foster care agencies. So it's a little bit different than the traditional foster care model. Ultimately, those of us who are the Medicaid providers of therapeutic foster care are the ones who need to identify those homes. That absolutely should be in partnership with lead agencies, with licensing agencies. There are some varying models across the state. In some circuits, the lead agency does the licensing of therapeutic agencies, and a Medicaid provider like us does the clinical overlay. In other circuits, like our program in Hillsborough County, we serve as both the licensing agency and the clinical services agency. So there's some local variation in who's responsible, but ultimately, I would say our approach is we need to grow our own capacity. It's something that we pursue, but where we don't serve as a licensing agency, ultimately that's something that we are dependent on the local lead agency and or their contracted licensing agencies to do so. The credentialing process is through ACA to become a Medicaid provider of therapeutic foster care services. So, but they're not going to seek out new agencies to become that type of Medicaid provider. Agencies like us have to pursue that credentialing. Does the physician-patient load limits apply to STFC outside of... So the caseload limits we talked about are for the primary clinicians, right? So that is not necessarily the psychiatrist, the MD. That is more typically the master's level therapist or the licensed clinical social or licensed mental health counselor, who is the one that's providing the day-to-day therapeutic care for the child. That caseload limit applies to the STFC caseload. So theoretically, I think this is what your question was getting at. Yes, a therapist who is providing STFC services can be involved in other types of work, can be providing other types of clinical services outside of the caseload limit of what they are allowed to carry for STFC. Now for CHN, it's a little mixed. We have a combination of full-time therapists and part-time therapists. Our full-time therapists only carry an STFC caseload. Our part-time therapists only carry an STFC caseload for us, although many of them have other clinical practices outside of CHN that they are allowed to pursue unrelated to their employment with us. And then I think the last one we have was about STFC parents and evaluation. So the answer is there's not a formal evaluation process, but there is heavy oversight of therapeutic foster homes. So one thing that I think is an important difference about the oversight of therapeutic foster parents as opposed to traditional foster parents is they're receiving oversight from multiple individuals from different perspectives. So a licensing specialist is still doing all of the regular face-to-face contacts that they would with a traditional foster parent. They're regularly reevaluating the home for compliance with licensure standards, assessing safety when they make their required visits to the home. They are being relicensed annually, just like every other traditional foster parent. So all of the oversight that a traditional foster parent receives as part of their regular face-to-face contacts with their licensing specialist and the annual relicensing process applies to the therapeutic foster parents. In addition to that, the therapists are in the homes regularly, and part of the therapist's role in going to the home is work with the foster parent. So an STFC therapist really has a dual role. They do provide individual therapy services to the child, but they are also required to work as a resource to the foster parent. So when a therapist makes their visit, they're going to do their session with the child, but they're also going to have conversation with the foster parent about how the child is doing. What does their progress look like? What do their behaviors look like? What are the interventions you are using with the child? And so it's the therapist's role to really ensure that the therapeutic foster parent is approaching the child's care in an appropriate way. In addition to both of those things, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, the therapeutic foster parents receive continuing education on the therapeutic foster care side, in addition to their regular continuing education for licensing purposes. And so there's constant re-instruction every 6 months with the therapeutic foster parents to reinforce the therapeutic techniques that they are supposed to be using. And the therapist is empowered and equipped to also provide individual direction if they are seeing that there's a different strategy that a parent should be employing with a particular child, or a strategy that is or a skill set that's lacking with that particular foster parent. I'd also say, and once again, I want to speak for CHN here, I can't speak for all therapeutic services providers, we really do embrace the idea of like knowing our foster parents deeply and incorporating them as part of our clinical team. And so when we evaluate our foster parents, it's not simply do they meet licensing requirements? Do they have, have they understood the clinical training they've received? We spend a lot of time on placement matching. We know that this foster parent does exceptionally well with a child of this age who presents with these behaviors. And this foster parent does exceptionally well with a child of this age who presents with these behaviors. And so that foster parent evaluation is not just about general skill level. If you're, I think, a sophisticated agency and you have a really well operating program, you're using constant evaluation of your foster parents for placement matching purposes to make sure that they are equipped for success or positioned for success with the placements you give them.
All right. I don't see any other questions for now. I'm going to take this opportunity to drop the CLE code in the chat. As I said earlier, this was approved for 1.5 General CLE and 1.5 Juvenile Law Certification Credits. The CLE code is 2513633N as in Nancy. I will send the CLE code via email as well. It will also be in the YouTube description later when I post it. And I want to take this opportunity first to thank Janine for running after Taylor 5 weeks ago, because if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have this amazing webinar. Taylor, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I don't know if there are any other questions, but you answered a lot of questions, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge in this particular topic. So Janine, any closing statements before we wrap up the webinar? You're muted, Janine.
I
There you
can
go.
even see that I was muted and I kept talking anyways. Just a big thank you to Taylor and really to also our audience members for asking such great questions. They were really meaningful and well informed, and I appreciate that. And it was a great discussion.
All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us. Taylor, any closing statements before we wrap up?
Closing statements. Just thank you for the opportunity to join this webinar. I think this is it's an important resource that I really want to see more people leveraging and using for the benefit of our kids.
Okay, couldn't agree more. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of your day and have a great weekend. Bye.
Be safe, everyone. Bye bye.